In 2020, a 57-year-old retired Navy veteran would pull over for a quick rest while on his way home from a work trip. He would call his wife to let her know of the detour. However, this would be the last time that she would speak to him. By the next evening, Bruce Ritchie's family would get the news that he had been killed. Welcome back to Vanished Memories, a channel dedicated to getting out lesser-known true crime and missing persons cases. My name is Brianna, and today I will be presenting to you the case of Bruce Ritchie, a 57-year-old retired Navy veteran who was a father of 6, who was senselessly killed on his way home from a work trip on May 22, 2020, while stopping for a quick rest in Virginia. To this day, his murder remains unsolved. If you are interested in this type of content, please don't forget to subscribe as I put out new videos every Wednesday. Now, before I fully get into this case, I do just want to shout out a Reddit thread that I used to actually help streamline the events in this case. It was a thread posted by the user Cheerful Refusal on the subreddit Unresolved Mysteries. I did speak to this user directly, who let me know that it was okay to cite them directly and use their work in this video, so I just wanted to thank them again for allowing me to do so. So without any further ado, let's get into the case of Bruce Ritchie. Bruce M. Ritchie was born on November 16, 1962 in Tishomingo, Oklahoma. He was born to parents Bruce and Naomi Ritchie. He had 3 siblings, brothers Don and Arliss, and a sister named Jennifer. Now, I'm not sure exactly where Bruce fell in this line of children. I'm not sure if he was the oldest, the youngest, or if he fell somewhere in the middle, but I did just want to point out we do know that he has 3 siblings. There's not much information on Bruce's childhood exactly, but I was able to find a comment that was left on his online obituary from his first wife, Amy, who would describe him as being a teenager who liked to challenge the established rules. She would write of Bruce, "He skipped a little school, partied a little, blew off homework, and challenged authority. But he was intelligent, adventurous, and so capable of achieving great things." Intelligent would be a very good word used to describe Bruce, who would immediately enlist in the Navy after graduating from high school in 1981. At the same time, he also had married his first wife, Amy, who I mentioned earlier. He would serve in the Navy for 26 years as an electronics technician, and in the intervening years he would have 2 children with his first wife, Amy. Over the course of his service, Bruce would serve during the Panama Invasion, Desert Storm, Iraq War, and the Afghanistan War. This would be all before he retired from his position as senior chief around 2007. Around the same time, Bruce and Amy would get a divorce, though from what I can tell, the separation seems relatively amicable. In his adult life, Bruce would be described as a jack-of-all-trades, and he was said to be extremely generous with his time and his skills. I think this is pretty evident, especially when you consider the fact that right before Bruce was killed, he actually was working on building a treehouse with his 4 adopted children, who he adopted with his wife Dawn. He had been married to Dawn since 2009, and at some point between 2009 and 2020, Bruce and Dawn decided to adopt 4 children, 3 of them being boys and 1 being a girl. Bruce was a very family-orientated person, and it's said that he liked to spend a lot of his time with his wife and children. But he also did his best to make time for his own personal goals. He prioritized his fitness, with it being said that he would swim about a mile every day. At the time of this case, Bruce would be working at the Westinghouse Electric Company in the position of a nuclear training specialist. According to the Reddit post that I had mentioned in the beginning of this case, this company was based out of Cranberry Township in Pennsylvania, and from what I was able to tell, that is accurate. They do have a location there, though it does seem that Bruce likely commuted about an hour or so to get to his work, when you consider the fact that he was a regular attendee of the New Stanton Assembly of God in New Stanton, Pennsylvania. This church is located about an hour away from where the company headquarters were located. So now that we know about Bruce and his background, let's get into the events that would unfortunately lead to Bruce's death. The day was Friday, May 22nd of 2020. On that day, Bruce Ritchie was traveling back to his home in Pennsylvania after being on a work trip in Waynesboro, Georgia. From what I can tell, Bruce's work trip brought him to Plant Vogtle, which is actually the largest nuclear power plant within the US, and it was owned by the company that Bruce had worked for, which was the Westinghouse Electric Company. Now, it's not exactly certain how long he had been on this business trip for, but it seems that this type of trip was fairly common for him, with his wife at the time, Dawn, recalling, I would say about 60 to 70% of his job was traveling. Bruce would make the trip back home in the white Nissan Sentra which he had rented with the Pennsylvania license plate LDZ 7337. The drive from his work trip to his home likely would have taken roughly about 10 hours. However, Bruce had actually booked a hotel room in West Virginia in order to break up his trip. Basically, the trip would have been broken around in half. Due to the timeline of events that we do know right now, I believe that Bruce likely had left from his work location at approximately 4:30 or 5 p.m., give or take some time for rest stops and speed of the vehicle. I believe that it's likely that Bruce had left around 5 p.m. that day due to the fact that he would make a stop at the border of West Virginia and Virginia. At around 10:30 p.m., which would be about 5.5 hours after he had left, he would call his wife Dawn and say that he was making a pit stop due to the fact that he had a headache. We know now for certain that Bruce had pulled off on an area of the shoulder of Wilderness Road on Route 606, just east of Interstate 77, exit 62 in Bastion, Virginia. You will be seeing that exact area on the Google Street View, which I recorded on screen. So, like I said, Bruce would pull off on this area due to the fact that he had a headache, and he would call his wife to let her know of this, stating that he just wanted to let the pain meds kick in a little bit more before he continued to his hotel room in West Virginia. Headaches seem to be unfortunately pretty common for Bruce, as his wife would actually say to reporters he had a headache 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, but it had gotten very severe that night, so he had taken some medication and pulled off on the side of the road to rest and let the medicine kick in before he went to his hotel. Before Dawn and Bruce would end the phone call that night, Dawn would tell Bruce to please give her a call once he arrives at his hotel room. However, the next morning when Dawn woke up, she had never gotten a call from him. Now, Dawn wasn't immediately worried that Bruce had not called her. She just assumed that he probably forgot and was back on the road and would be home within the next few hours. However, Bruce would not arrive home, and Dawn's worry would begin to grow. She would start to repeatedly call Bruce that day, though all calls remained unanswered. This was very atypical for Bruce, as we know that he was a big family man and likely always kept in close contact with his wife. However, Dawn had heard what she referred to in an article as the typical TV expectation, which was that you could not report someone as missing until 24 hours after the fact. This is, unfortunately, a very common misconception, often perpetuated by bad police practices. But no, you do not have to wait 24 hours after you believe that someone had gone missing. You can report them straight away. Legally, police are obligated to investigate as soon as they get a report. But unfortunately, like I said, Dawn would decide to wait due to that misconception that she had, and she did end up reporting her husband Bruce as missing on the night of Saturday, the 23rd, so about a full day after their last phone conversation on the night of May 22nd. Just about an hour after Bruce was reported as missing, Pennsylvania state troopers would show up to Dawn and Bruce's home, and when they showed up, they would give Dawn the news that she had been dreading. Bruce had actually been found dead earlier that day. The discovery of Bruce's body wasn't actually made until around noon on Saturday, May 23rd, so this would have been the day after he started his trip home. Around 12:30 that afternoon, a passerby in the area near where Bruce's car had been pulled off to the side of the road actually found Bruce's body in a ditch. The ditch where Bruce's body was found was actually about 20 to 30 feet off the road. There was a ditch pretty close to his car, which I was able to find on Google Street View, so I'll show that again to you now. I'm not 100% sure if this was exactly the ditch where he was found, but it seems like it is likely that it is. After the passerby found Bruce's body, they would of course call the police, and from what I'm able to tell, the Virginia State Police were actually the ones dispatched to the scene. When they arrived, they would find Bruce's body, as he was already deceased, though of course they did not know his name at this point, but they only knew that he was a white male. In the investigation that followed, investigators would realize that it was likely that Bruce had died sometime between the late night of May 22nd and the early hours of May 23rd, given the state of his body. Now, of course, there is a gap of time between when Bruce is likely to have died versus when his body was found, but it was theorized that he had not been found until that time due to the tall grass that surrounded the ditch. Likely drivers who passed by that area wouldn't have been able to see anything from their vehicles. So when police initially looked around the area, they also found a knife lying beside him in the ditch. This was a Mossy Oak brand hunting knife, which was found to have blood on it, and later it would be confirmed that that blood belonged to Bruce. Upon arrival at the death scene, the police would, of course, eventually realize that the white Nissan parked on the side of the road likely did belong to the victim, which is, as we now know, Bruce. Police would observe that there was actually blood on and around the vehicle at the time. They observed a small pool of blood on the ground in front of the car, as well as some blood near the passenger side door, and additional smears of blood on the body of the car. All this blood would later be confirmed to belong to Bruce. Now, I do just want to say here, I'm not sure exactly when they identified Bruce as being the victim. I'm assuming it could have been around here, given the fact that when police searched the car, they were able to find a wallet inside. That wallet belonged to Bruce, and of course the photo on the ID in that wallet would have matched up to Bruce. However, I'm not sure why it would have taken them so long to actually notify Dawn and the rest of Bruce's family about his death, because there is that gap of time between when his body was discovered, car was searched, and when Dawn was notified of his death. I'm just not sure why it would have taken them so long, since we know that she likely did report him missing later in the day on Saturday, and they had some time before then to notify her, but I'm assuming maybe they were still working out the crime scene and looking into positively identifying him. And also, due to the fact that Bruce lived in Pennsylvania, but he died in Virginia, it probably also could have been a jurisdictional issue. I did just want to make you aware of that. I do know that there's kind of a weird gap in between. I think it's just probably procedural. So anyways, the police, like I said, would examine the car, both inside and out. And when they looked inside the car, there were a few things that stuck out to the police. The first thing, of course, was that Bruce's personal effects were still in there. His phone, wallet, computer, and luggage were all sitting in the car still. I also am assuming that the keys were still in the car since the car was never stolen, though it doesn't explicitly say that keys were found, but I'm going to just assume that they were still in the vehicle at the time. Now, this is important when you consider the fact that all of the items that it was known that Bruce had with him were still accounted for. So it doesn't really seem plausible that robbery was any type of motive in Bruce's death. I will be discussing that a little bit later on too when I get into the theories in this case. In addition to the items left behind in the vehicle, police also noted that the driver's seat was in a reclined position. This was likely done by Bruce, given the fact that we know that he pulled over to rest and probably just wanted to get into a more comfortable position to do so. This is notable though, since it seems to indicate that whoever had killed Bruce had likely taken him off guard. So Bruce likely didn't have time or didn't bother to put his seat back up into a straightened position. Beyond these discoveries in the car, police would also confirm that it didn't seem like there was any disruption in the car, so it didn't seem like anyone had gone through it, which we probably could have inferred anyways, given the fact that no expensive items were taken, so it didn't seem like whoever had killed Bruce had intended to rob the vehicle. Of course, we know that sometime in the later hours of that day, the police would eventually inform Dawn of what had happened to her husband Bruce. Instantly, Dawn would become a widowed mother of 4 children. But Dawn would say to the papers, "I just made a determination early on that the person who took him away from us wasn't getting anything else from us. So I've tried to just kind of focus on moving forward, taking care of the kids, just kind of living the way he would have wanted us to live instead of dwelling on the situation." And as Dawn attempted to get some normalcy back into her life, police would try to get some answers as to who had killed Bruce. An autopsy would be performed on Bruce in order to determine his cause of death. It would be determined that he died as a result of a stabbing. He had a single stab wound to the back, as well as a defensive wound to his right hand, indicating to investigators that he at least tried to fight back in some way. But it seems as though this attack really did take him off guard, so he didn't really have much time to defend himself. One of the biggest reasons that a lot of people agree that Bruce was taken off guard was the fact that investigators actually noticed that the back of his shirt had been stretched out in two areas, near the neck and the tail area, almost as if someone had grabbed him as he turned around, or someone had grabbed him as he was trying to flee. Now, there was, of course, a more thorough investigation launched after the initial investigation of the crime scene, and Virginia State Police would start to try to get some eyewitnesses and some accounts of people who had seen the vehicle, but unfortunately nothing had panned out. At the time of Bruce's death, of course, it would have been late at night, and it's likely that not many people were around, if any, besides Bruce and his killer. Now, of course, we do know that there was blood on near the car, and it might seem a little bit weird that no one else had reported that prior to Bruce's discovery, but I think you do have to consider the fact that the strip of road where the car was and where Bruce was a 45-mile-an-hour strip of road off of an interstate. It seems likely that a lot of people would have been driving fast or not really paying much attention to their surroundings at the time. We do know that there was a small pool of blood in front of the car, but it's likely that people wouldn't have really thought much of it. And while there was some blood smeared on the car and near the passenger door, but the passenger side was facing away from the road, so people wouldn't have been able to see that. Also, I do just want to note that I don't think that this vehicle being parked on the side of the road really would have raised much suspicion. I actually had looked back into the Google Street View history of this area, and there's 5 separate years where you can see photos of the area, and in all 5 separate years there's cars pulled off on either shoulder of the road. So it seems like this is a pretty common area for cars to be there, whether it's for someone having car trouble or someone needing to stop to take a break or rest in Bruce's case. Like I said, I just don't think that it really caused much alarm for a car to be on the side of the road, especially when you consider the fact that it was only there for about 14 hours before Bruce's discovery. Now, of course, like I said, police didn't get really anything substantial from possible witnesses from around the area, so they would decide to look into Bruce's cell phone records. Using this data, they were able to determine that Bruce had made a stop for fuel at a Love's truck stop in Lambsburg, Virginia, which was about an hour's drive away from where he had stopped off Interstate 77. Since authorities knew this, they would actually go to that truck stop to look for surveillance video, and they would spot Bruce in his vehicle alone. So at that time, an hour before Bruce had pulled off of Interstate 77, he was alone and unaccompanied by anyone in his vehicle. Which this, of course, does make sense. There was no indication that he was traveling with anyone else, especially since he was coming home from a solo work trip. And also, it doesn't seem he had a history of picking up hitchhikers or anything. And you would assume that if he had, for some reason, picked someone up, he probably would have told his wife when they were on the phone. Or his wife maybe would have heard someone else in the background, but we know that she didn't. So at this point, we know that whoever had killed Bruce did not seem to do so with intention of taking his things. Bruce was known to be alone in his vehicle, and unfortunately no one had seen anything suspicious that night. Unfortunately, there really was no indication as to who had done this to Bruce, so kind of as a last resort, police would attempt to do some forensic testing. Now, of course, we do know that forensic testing showed that the blood on and around the car and on the knife belonged to Bruce, but police were hoping that they would be able to get some of the attacker's blood possibly off of the knife, since it's pretty common for attackers in stabbing cases to accidentally cut themselves in the process, but unfortunately the only DNA that they were able to extract was Bruce's. In the years since Bruce's death, investigators would say, "We've been down several rabbit holes while attempting to find Bruce's killer." They've had no tips relating to the case, at least as of an article that was published in 2022, 2 years after his death, and unfortunately there's really no way to eliminate some theories given little to basically no evidence. At one point, a profiler from the Virginia State Police told investigators that the offender appeared to be disorganized and could possibly be a transient in the area, and because of that, investigators had spoken to 2 different transients that were known to be in the area at the time, but one person was ruled out, and the other person can't be ruled out, but there's also no evidence to rule them in either. There were more items of evidence in this case that were processed in 2022. At the time, it was said that a private lab was testing Bruce's shirt for any extra DNA, hoping to find touch DNA, which would require a very, very small sample in order to create a profile. However, an investigator had actually spoken with the paper that reported this and stated that he believed it was probably pretty unlikely for any touch DNA to be found, given the fact that there was so much DNA from Bruce that had overwhelmed the shirt. There was so much blood on the shirt from him. And also, unfortunately, it was discovered that it had actually rained that morning between Bruce's death and the time of his discovery, so it's likely that some of the evidence then was also washed away. Now, we don't know what the results were on that shirt. Police were hoping that maybe it would lead back to the transient that they couldn't rule out, but at this moment there was no public release of the results of that forensic examination. So I am inclined to believe that either police are working on something in the background, or unfortunately evidence just wasn't able to be gathered from that testing, and they're kind of back to square one with no evidence and no solid leads to get them anywhere. With all that being said though, now that we know about Bruce's case and what happened before, during, and after it in the investigation, let's get into the theories in this case. Now, these theories that I'm going to present to you kind of come from the Reddit post that I mentioned. This Reddit poster actually does a very good job of laying out the theories, so if you want to look a little bit more into their theories, I'll link that in the description box below. Some of the theories that they mention I'm not going to mention here because they're a little bit far-fetched for me, but I think it's worth taking a look into, and again, thank you to that Reddit poster for writing such a good article on that. So let's get into the theories in this case. I have 3 ones that I'm going to present to you, and as I do in all my videos, I'm going to start with least believable to most believable, at least in my opinion. So in my opinion, the least believed theory for me is that this was a planned attack. So this theory basically states that whatever happened to Bruce was planned in advance. It could be possible that someone who knew Bruce personally may have targeted him that day and planned to do what they did, or maybe someone that Bruce had met on the road just that day could have had some intention of doing the same thing. However, I don't think this theory really holds much ground, and there's a few reasons for that. The first thing is, what would the motive really be for someone to have killed Bruce that day? If it was someone in his personal life, why would they have chose to kill him? It seems that from all accounts, Bruce was a really good guy, he was generous and kind, and he didn't have any known enemies. Now, I did think about the possibility that maybe this could have been a road rage situation. Possibly Bruce could have accidentally cut someone off, or someone just felt like they had wronged him. It's not impossible for crazy things like this to come out of a road rage incident, unfortunately. But I just think that there's a few things to disprove this. And the first thing is that we know that Bruce had called his wife that night, and if he believed that he was being followed, you'd assume that he would have sounded distressed or told his wife what was going on, or she maybe would have heard something in the background. But from all accounts by her, Bruce seemed relatively normal on the phone that night. Also, it definitely would have raised some red flags for him if he noticed a car pulling off of the interstate at the same time that he did, and then proceeding to park behind him. So you'd think that he would have just driven away or reported something to police, or at least told his wife, or just sounded distressed in some way. But again, we know that he didn't, so I just don't think that it really makes sense for this to have been a planned attack. So that takes us to theory number 2, and that is that the main motive here was robbery, and basically it was a robbery gone wrong. I do think that there could be some ground that this could have started as a possible robbery. He was driving a nice vehicle, and he was off to the side on the road alone at night, but it doesn't really make much sense for this to have started with a robbery motive, but then that person chose to just kill Bruce and not take anything of value. Also, for someone to choose to rob a vehicle that they know has an occupant inside, it's just a very high risk. So could robbery have been an initial motive, but then it spiraled out of hand? Possibly, but considering that not a thing was taken, not even any cash or anything from his wallet as far as we know, it just doesn't make sense. Also, a vehicle was there, which was a pretty nice vehicle. All of his electronics were in there. It just doesn't make sense for someone to intend to take his things, but then kill him and not take his things. So, like I said, robbery doesn't really seem to make much sense. But I think what does make sense is theory number 3, which is that this was a random attack or a crime of opportunity. This seems to be the most generally accepted theory in the case. We know from the Virginia State Police profiler that they believe that whoever had done this attack was very disorganized and frenzied, likely leading people to believe that it was not planned and just kind of random. It seems that Bruce really was just in the wrong place at the wrong time that night, and whoever had chosen to kill him that night chose to do so just because they wanted to, and with no real motive behind it besides, unfortunately, ending his life. I did just want to present a little sub-theory within this theory. I wasn't really sure where to put this sub-theory, but I just wanted to mention it here because I think it could explain how Bruce had gotten out of the car that night. So this theory is actually presented by Bruce's wife, Dawn, and she believes that it's likely that what had happened to Bruce that night started with the person luring him out of the vehicle, possibly by feigning needing help. This could have been by saying that they had vehicle troubles or were wounded in some way, and Bruce likely would have helped that person. Dawn would say to newspapers, "This is my own kind of theory, but if he were laying there sleeping and somebody knocked on his window trying to get his attention and he got out thinking he was going to help somebody, that's just who he was." Unfortunately, even though Bruce thought that he was helping somebody, that person would come to hurt him and eventually kill him, likely grabbing him by the back of the shirt as he walked away to try to help them with something, and then unfortunately stabbing him and killing him. It also makes sense that the perpetrator of this act would have done that to lure him out of the vehicle, knowing that if he was out of the vehicle, he likely wouldn't have any weapons on him. Also, being out of the vehicle, he wouldn't have been able to just drive away. Unfortunately, though, we can theorize about this case, but at the end of the day, it remains unsolved almost 6 years later. There have been a few public appeals for information from police, but unfortunately those seem to stop in 2023, so it doesn't seem like there's really been much police outreach or police involvement with trying to close the case, at least not publicly, for the past 3 years. However, if you or anyone you know has any information about the murder of Bruce Ritchie, please contact the proper authorities. Their information, of course, as always, will be in the description box below as well as on screen. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to the case of 57-year-old Bruce Ritchie, who unfortunately was murdered in Virginia on May 22nd of 2020. His case to this day remains unsolved. If you enjoyed learning about this case or found it educational, please don't hesitate to like, subscribe, comment, or share this video. Again, my name is Brianna, and thank you so much for joining me on this episode of Vanished Memories. Bye!